the history of the death penalty. The earliest recorded accounts of a death penalty dates back to 18th century BC Babylon, where the Code of Hammurabi was inscribed and named after the then current and 16th king. One section of the code detailed the 25 crimes that were punished by death, with each crime having its own unique execution, such as if a lover planned to murder their spouse, they would be impaled. If family members were caught in an incestuous relationship, they were burnt alive. And if a person stole from another's household, they were to be executed and have their remains buried in the walls of the house. Although, even with these laws in place, the first recorded account of a government-held execution happened in Egypt during the 16th century BC. In the case, a man of nobility was ordered to commit suicide after being accused of performing magic. Later on, death penalties were adopted in other cultures' governments, some being the Hittite Code, the Roman Law of the 12 Tablets, and the Draconian Code of Athens. While those listed had similar processes, with executions carried out in battery, drowning, impalement, immolation, and crucifixions, the Draconian Code is most noteworthy as it had all crimes punishable by death. As centuries passed on, society as a whole changed, and alongside society's evolution was the death penalty. While the previous methods were still used, there were some new techniques that were brought up at this time. Now, as the death penalty is a form of punishment, the governments made it sure this was not a slap on the wrist. One group of methods can be categorized with animals, with said executions being held in nations that had such animals. There is the often alluded to lion's den, where criminals would be thrown into a den of lions. Aside from lions, convicts also would have been devoured by sharks and crocodiles. The Roman Empire had a technique called poinacale, which translates to penalty of the sack. During the execution, the condemned was thrown into a large sack with an assortment of small animals, such as snakes, dogs, chickens, or a monkey, and then the sack was thrown into a body of water. Though what is probably accounted as the most brutal execution was being trampled by an elephant. To put things in perspective, both African and Asian elephants' weight ranges between 6,000 and 12,000 pounds, while the average weight of a modern car is approximately 3,000 pounds. Aside from animals, one of the most torturous execution methods was the brazen bull. The brazen bull was a hollowed bronze statue of a bull that had a door where criminals would be stuffed inside of it. Once the prisoner was placed inside, the door was locked and a fire started underneath the bull, roasting the man alive. Another technique used was sawing. First recorded in China and then later spread to Europe, sawing was when the felon would be sawed in half. It was preferred to have the cutting start at the criminal's bottom, not just because of the obvious that they would have died too fast if it had started at his head, but with the blood rushing to the victim's head, it would let the excruciating torture last substantially longer. Skip to a millennia later, and the death penalty has changed once again. Crucifixions have become less common, while beheadings and hangings have become the new normality. Though the most cruel new technique was being drawn and quartered. Popularized in Britain, those accused of treason were dragged throughout the streets of the city before having their individual limbs tied to horses and eventually ripped from their body. One of the most famous people that was executed with this method was Sir William Wallace. After being captured during his campaign in the First Scottish War for Independence, Wallace was convicted of high treason under King Edward I and then hanged, drawn, and quartered. Another popular process in Britain was the use of a pendulum, where a saw blade was attached to the bottom of a pendulum device that would slowly cut the victim in half. A garrote was another form of execution. First used in the Roman Empire, but popularized in Spain, a garrote was a collar or chain wrapped around the convicted's neck and tightened to the point of strangulation. By the 1000s, the Dark Ages of Europe had begun, and life was just as dark as it seems. People could be sentenced to death for even the most unconventional and mundane acts, such as marrying a Jewish person or not confessing to committing a crime. Later, in the 15th century, the number of impalements rose exponentially with the Romanian reign of Vlad III, or more commonly known as Vlad the Impaler, a madman so bloodthirsty and cruel. Centuries later, Irish author Bram Stoker based the character Count Dracula upon him. Soon enough, in the 14th century, the first guns were invented, and with the realization of their devastating power, they were implemented in the use of the death penalty. In the 11th century, there was a rather monumental moment in the death penalty's history when King William I abolished capital punishment in England, having it only be used during war times, making it the first time a major government had the death penalty abolished. Yet, this was later revoked in the 16th century, where under the reign of Henry VIII, there was a recorded 72,000 people executed. With this, the number of crimes punishable by death continuously rose, and by the 1700s, there were 222 crimes punishable by death. Following the law was so tedious that a person could be put to death for simply cutting down a tree. Though, soon enough, juries had convinced Parliament to reform the laws, and in the 1820s, 100 of the 222 crimes were relegated. Once America was discovered, it was governed and colonized under the British rule. In the 17th century, New England laws were just as relentless as its originating neighbors. Under the Morrill and Marshall Acts, stealing from gardens and trading with Native Americans were punishable by death. Though the first recorded execution in the British colonies was actually quite serious. In 1608, Captain George Kendall was executed by firing squad for being a spy for Spain. After the Revolutionary War, capital punishment stayed with the United States, though which crimes were punishable by death depended on which state. By the 1800s, public executions became too disturbing for the public eye and were thus performed in private. Afterwards, when re-evaluating the Bill of Rights, one concern was considered. Under the 8th Amendment, a citizen had the right to not endure cruel and unusual punishments. So would the death penalty count as a cruel and unusual punishment? The debate has been going on for years. Opposition waxed and waned, depending on the time. The closest thing to the United States government's conclusion is that they would only allow the most humane executions. Otherwise, the federal government leaves this decision up to the states. Some states, like Rhode Island and Michigan, outlawed the capital punishment. Yet, it does not stop there. Thomas Edison, in his discovery of electricity in the 1880s, demonstrated the dangers of alternate currents by electrocuting dogs, cats, horses, cows, a monkey, and even an elephant who killed 3 of her handlers. With such a discovery, death by electrocution was implemented with the death penalty. More discoveries were made for more humane executions. In the early 20th century, the use of gas chambers were implemented as well as lethal injections, which would be first used in the 1980s. Though one monumental action was made in 1972. In the case of Furman v. Georgia, the Supreme Court had it ruled that, under the 8th Amendment, the death penalty shall be abolished nationwide. For 4 years, it was abolished. That being, in the 1976 Gregg v. Georgia case, the Supreme Court decided to bring it back, simply for the state's freedom's sake.